Hello everyone, my name is Jo. Today I want to discuss the quote or the statistic that 100 companies are responsible for like 71% of carbon emissions over the past 30 years or so. I have seen this a lot, mostly from people who are fairly involved, like environmental activists reposting tweets about it, that sort of thing, mostly in the context of people saying, don't feel guilty about your behavior because the true culprit are these 100 companies. And so I just kind of wanted to discuss this, look at the stats on it. We're barely going to scratch the surface because obviously this is a huge topic, but just kind of look at personal responsibility versus corporate responsibility in climate change. So the origin of this stat is from a report called the Carbon Majors Report from 2017. And in case you weren't sure, it's not being misquoted, it does say that 100 companies are kind of responsible for approximately 71% of emissions from 1988 to 2015. So when I first heard this stat, I really thought it was going to be kind of the companies that you usually hear talked about in a negative way, like Procter & Gamble, Unilever, Coca-Cola, Nestle, I don't know, just kind of your typical corporate villains, I guess. But then when I actually looked at the report, I kind of had a moment like, oh, well, duh, because every single one of these 100 companies are fossil fuel extractors. So there's coal companies, there's oil and gas companies, and that's pretty much it. So the report collects data on basically two different portions of the life cycle of these fossil fuels. The first one is the actual emissions from the operations carried out by the company. So that would be operating the company, extracting the fuel. I don't know if they do refining in-house, I don't know. The second part, which the report calls Scope 3, is all downstream emissions that are a result of that product being created. So once the oil or gas or coal has been produced and sold to someone else, everything that happens to it after that point. Just one note that this does not include carbon dioxide emissions from the category of land use change, forestry, or agricultural methane. The EPA says that that category is responsible for about 10% of greenhouse gas emissions, but I did find a Forbes article that suggested that that was probably a big underestimate. So just an FYI, this is not a complete picture, but it is kind of the bulk of greenhouse gas emissions. I was no longer surprised by the 100 companies once I found out that they were all fossil fuel companies. If you start at the very beginning and you say that they are responsible for everything that happens downstream, they're going to be responsible for everything. That's all there is to it. Not saying that that's incorrect, by the way, but the thing that I think is not being reported completely accurately regarding this report is that over 90% of the emissions happen in that second category. I was going to kind of create something to visualize this, but then when I was reading up on this, I actually found a blog post that had already done that for me. It is by an academic blogger named Stephen E. Eikenberry, hopefully, at environmath.org. So he has a really great blog post all about this that I will link below, so check that out if you're interested in more. So just kind of an overview based on this figure that he prepared. The 100 company statistic assigns responsibility exclusively on this kind of left-hand side of the production, and it ignores everything that happens after that point. And I can see why they did this, because obviously they are ultimately responsible. If they had never gotten those fossil fuels out of the ground, then nobody would have been able to make the emissions that followed. However, and the blogger also makes this point, does it matter that it was 100 companies if the demand already existed for those fossil fuels. If we had the same demands that we have now, and it was 1,000 companies producing those fossil fuels, would that make any substantial difference? And I can see both sides of the argument, because you could say, oh, well, 100 companies is such a small number of companies that would have to change their policies in order to change things. But the problem is more with the demand for fossil fuels than necessarily the companies that are extracting them, although in no way am I giving those companies a pass. I'm absolutely not. So, in some weird, extremely inaccurate way, the fossil fuel companies could actually kind of turn around and say, well, actually, we only did 10% of these emissions. It's not our fault that we sold you these products and then you did other things with them. That would be, to be clear, ridiculous and completely inaccurate, but I don't think that the 100 company statistic is really beneficial, so that's kind of what we're going to get into. So I guess at this point I will interject with the opposite side, which is the personal carbon footprint, because this is another thing that I've seen posted about a lot, about how BP started the personal carbon footprint. And this is pretty much true. In 2004, BP unveiled a carbon footprint calculator, twisting the work of an ecologist named William Rees, who had devised a way for people to determine how much actual physical land was needed to sustain their lifestyle, whether they lived in a city or in the country. And he called this the ecological footprint. BP and future proponents of the carbon footprint encourage people to look at their decisions to see how they could reduce their emissions. This sounds admirable, especially to an individualistic society like the United States, who loves to feel like they have choices and, you know, the freedom to do whatever they want, you know, whatever. However, there are some pretty obvious issues with a major provider of a substance that has been made basically impossible to avoid using in your life, then policing the people who have no choice but to use it and saying that it's their responsibility to stop using it. BP insists that they weren't trying to outsource responsibility for carbon emissions, but most people seem to disagree, and I can't really say that I blame them. Nevertheless, personal carbon footprint has definitely stuck around. It's a very common measurement now, and I do think it has some use. I think that looking at the carbon footprint between groups of people can be really helpful, like between economic classes, between different countries, etc. I don't think that it's a useless metric, but I think it also reduces climate change to one single issue of carbon and methane emissions. That is obviously a massive and critical piece of climate change, but it's not the only piece. We also have things like deforestation, disruption of the water cycle, plastic piled up all around the planet in our oceans, electronic waste, and a host of other issues that are indirect or direct causes of climate change and are a result of our rampant consumerist culture. So to be clear, I'm also not saying that all of the responsibility should be pushed to the right, to the consumer side. Because if you'll notice here, a lot of these are essential things that we ultimately don't have a lot of choice over. You may be able to change your energy provider for your house, heating and cooling. I recommend that you check out if you can, because a lot of people can, but you may not be able to. You may not be able to afford an electric vehicle, and you may not have public transportation near you, so you may have to use a gas vehicle. There are a lot of things on here that we don't have a system or infrastructure that allows people to make consumer choices. So I'm also in no way saying that the responsibility should be pushed all the way to the consumers. That is part of the reason why I also don't like the 100 companies statistic, because whether you push it all the way to the left or all the way to the right, that means you are letting off every single company in between scot-free. You're just like, you guys get a free pass, I guess, because you didn't get the fossil fuel out of the ground, and you weren't necessarily the end consumer of the product, so it all just cancels out, when obviously it does not, and obviously they are responsible for so much. I think that it just reduces this down to way too simple of a little statistic. So the way that I see it, we kind of have two categories of possible responses to climate change, assuming that we are planning to do anything about it at all. The first one is kind of the realistic way, which is what most people, I think, are striving towards. This is kind of generally an attempt to innovate our way out of the crisis, mostly provides kind of one-to-one substitutes for most of the things that we're used to, and all that is required of the general public is to accept those substitutes, which for some reason seems to be a struggle in and of itself, and then just to continue feeding the profit machine. You're not stopping buying things, you're buying the green alternatives. You're not using less energy, you're using green energy, etc. This, in my mind, looks something like the power grid and homes being mostly or entirely powered by renewable energy. Personal vehicles are electric or other non-fossil fuel powered. Maybe some reduced meat consumption, probably more likely things like lab-grown meats. Maybe some improvement of public transportation, increased legislation to control environmental impacts, etc. Now, this kind of sounds like a paradise at this point, but ultimately, in my opinion, this solution is still really only working for the wealthiest parts of the world. It still doesn't address so many core issues that exist with our society as a whole, unsolved issues with these innovations. I think that often people who want to fix things, and I totally understand this because obviously you want there to be a solution and you want there to be something that makes it better, but we're unwilling to see the downsides of these things. I kind of just want to go through a couple of the green technologies that I think do have downsides. Carbon offsetting is a big thing that a lot of companies who say they are trying to go carbon zero this is one of their primary methods that they are trying to do it, is they're not going to zero on emissions. They're maybe trying to reduce their emissions, but then they are paying to offset the emissions that they do have. And this is primarily through planting trees and stuff like that, which sounds like a great thing. Obviously, we want to plant trees. The problem is something called carbon colonialism, and I will link a great post and podcast by the Green Dreamer who talks about this in more detail, but basically this results in land grabs by corporations in countries primarily in the global south, displacing indigenous people and harming the population in the area. There's a lot of issues with it, and it's very difficult to tell if a company is doing it in an ethical way when you sign up for one. Other potential issues are things like geothermal energy has a potential for greatly increasing earthquakes in the region, or potentially injecting hot, polluted water into aquifers that are the source of drinking water for local populations. Again, I have an article about this below. I don't think there have been any known contamination cases yet, but the article that I am sharing, I can't say with 100% certainty whether it's accurate or not, but they had what seemed like a contamination event that was not considered a contamination event. So technologies like windmills and solar panels are great for producing energy without needing fossil fuels, but they still do require rare earth metals for batteries and other technologies that requires mining, which is often done in extremely unethical circumstances. You can look into the cobalt mining that has been done for lithium batteries that is often done by child laborers. And we really don't have a system in place to deal with these materials when they are done. We don't have any kind of system for repairing or reusing dead batteries and that sort of thing, getting those back down to their component pieces so that they can be reused. So right now, I'm pretty sure they are all going into landfills. So, questions that we still have about those. And I know that a lot of people would say well, you can't demand a perfect solution. And I agree. I'm not saying that we shouldn't try to do these things. But the second kind of potential response that I see is actual radical change. And I think that this is something that most people, even like activists and politicians, are really not necessarily thinking about as a viable option. So the Industrial Revolution was the beginning of climate change. And I think that a fundamental mistake so many people make is thinking that we can keep everything that we feel like we gained from the Industrial Revolution and somehow get rid of all of the consequences. I just no longer really feel like that is possible. I think that everything has a cost, and I don't mean an economic cost necessarily, and I just don't know. I don't know if it's a price that we should be willing to pay. So this is not, I cannot remotely take credit for this ideology in any way. I have exclusively learned this from the work of Indigenous activists, Black activists, reading the work of academics in this area. You know, I will share some of the resources that I have been learning from. But I think it is really important to think about the fact that humans were existing on this planet for millions of years without major issues. And then we have the Industrial Revolution, and bam, 200 years later, we have made significant progress to killing everything on the planet. And that is not a coincidence. And I don't think that that's something that we can use that same mindset of growth and technology to innovate our way out of. So to me, radical change really seems like it would only happen through Indigenous sovereignty, deindustrialization, local economies, local food production, and just really, really fundamental changes in how we live, including things like personal vehicles only existing for those who genuinely need them, such as the elderly, people with mobility issues, ambulances. You know, I think that there are things that would be great if we could keep from all of the innovation that has happened over the past 200 years. But I also think it's unrealistic to think that we can keep all of it. I don't have any idea how much of the industrialization, you know, we would have to roll back. I have no idea. But I think that right now, it's not even on our radar to do that. And it needs to be, in my opinion. The bottom line is that if we are creating more carbon emissions than the Earth is capable of accommodating in the carbon cycle, then we are always going to be slowly moving this direction. And if we're putting more pollutants into the water than the Earth is capable of filtering out on its own, we are always going to have to treat our water for all of the poisons that we're putting in it. We might be able to, and still should try to, stop rapid climate change with, you know, new technologies and that sort of thing. But we also have to think about where the planet will be in centuries, like we should have been doing this whole time. I'm just going to share a quote from a Native Daughter, which I highly recommend for anyone who wants to learn more about kind of the indigenous perspective of the Earth versus the settler colonialist perspective. But where do people in the industrial countries draw their battle lines? On the side of Mother Earth, on the side of consumption, on the side of first world nationalism? If human beings, native and non-native alike, are to create an alternative to the planned New World Order, then those who live in the first world must change their culture, not only their leaders. And I think that's something that is so important because so many people have given up on personal change because they don't feel like it can do anything. And I definitely understand that perspective. It is incredibly difficult in a system that is so rigged. But I think that pretending that we can elect leaders who will change this when we have seen that no matter who we elect, nothing changes, that it's not realistic. I know that they say that it's not realistic to demand fundamental radical change, but I would say it's not realistic at this point to expect voting to do much of anything since we have seen that it doesn't. It just keeps moving more towards corporations getting exactly what they want. I just want to give something of a disclaimer to say that if you're here to try to make as much consumer change as you can, that's great, but the bulk of this burden needs to be on people who do have choices, and I would encourage people to consider how much choice they do have, because I think Many of us have more than we realize, but if you are someone who truly is struggling to provide for yourself, for your family, you just have to do what you have to do. So I will have many resources linked below if you're curious more about this topic or people who I recommend educating yourself from. Let me know what you think, and if you'd like to hear more from me, then subscribe. Thanks!